Internet travelers, and welcome to the Twin Cities Creation Science Association's podcast. Today's episode features Russ McGlenn. He has some interesting insight into astronomy, subatomic particles, and even the age of the universe itself. Hey, Russ, thanks so much for coming on our podcast. Our first question involves Pluto. The data sent back to Earth from the New Horizons probe has been interpreted by scientists only from an evolutionary worldview. The Undiscovered Country means that much about Pluto is undiscovered because of their bias. Much of the Undiscovered Country is data that shows God did it, however. What are some of the things about Pluto that were unexpected?
Well, I did several studies on the data that they, came back. One of the things they found were what they call icy volcanoes or cryovolcanoes. And the only way we can have volcanoes is if we have a hot core in the center of the planet. They also found that there's dunes made out of, they call them dunes made out of solid methane ice grains on the surface. That says this again requires a hot core to generate the heat to melt and then send this stuff to the surface so that it'll freeze in the atmosphere there of Pluto. Then the third thing is they say there has to be a hot core in order for these different activities to take place. And so the interesting information is on their report about this. They say, quote, what they found on Pluto was not at all what they were expecting to find. Scientists were expecting to find it heavily cratered, a flat, dead world, similar to our moon. And that's a quote from their report. The interesting thing about the moon is when the astronauts went there, Apollo 15 astronauts put a seismograph there and discovered moonquakes, which again would prove it had a hot core. Couldn't be 4.5 billion years old because at that age they had predicted, based on the theory, that the moon would be totally dead, no moonquakes or anything else.
A little bit off topic, what is your opinion of the theory that Pluto isn't even a planet?
Right. That's been a controversy since Tombaugh died, who discovered it back in the 30s. He, after 2 weeks after he died, they began to reclassify it and try to reclassify it as an asteroid or a comet or some other thing that flew in from outer space. I studied the material on what they define a planet as. They say, well, a planet has to have a moon. Well, right there they were in trouble because Mercury doesn't have a moon. And then we discovered with the flyby, or in the last, I guess with the flyby, that Pluto has 5 moons. The second thing they said was that a planet has to be able to sweep out all the debris in its orbit. Well, Jupiter in its orbit has 2 asteroid fields following it or preceding it. And so that doesn't apply there either. The third thing is that planets, to be classified as a planet, has to have some kind of a atmosphere. And of course, the Mercury doesn't, neither does the moon, our moon. Of course, it's not classified as a planet. So they've fought over this for the last 30 or 40 years and still cannot come up with a conclusion of what is a planet, because Pluto has 5 moons, so why isn't it a planet? My classification of a planet is that it is a object that can have life on it. The Greeks called it planets, which means wanderer, and when they looked up in the sky, they would see that Mars and the other planets wander. They go through the star systems, whereas other stars stay there. The stars stay there all the time, so they call them wanderers. I classify a planet as having water, having life, being green, and able to sustain life. Therefore, there's only one planet in the solar system, and that's Earth. The rest of the objects I call satellites that help keep the Earth in a balanced orbit around the sun, because they help using their gravity wells to keep a balance between the sun's gravity, Earth's gravity, and the other satellites. So that's why I eliminate the whole planet problem of what is a planet and what isn't.
Why were scientists surprised by what they found on Pluto?
They were unexpected because the Big Bang dust cloud nebular theory has many flaws in it. Often what they predict from it ends up being just the opposite. When they sent a probe to Jupiter many years ago, and it went into the surface and finally went down into the gaseous envelope and was finally melted, the data it sent back, again, the scientists said, wow, this isn't what we expected at all. I made a whole list of what they predicted and what they actually found, and it's very, very different. Again, because the Big Bang dust cloud theory is flawed and based on faulty scientific assumptions, then its predictions almost always turn out to be wrong. The same thing with the probes they've sent to Mars. They've sent over 15 probes and keep looking for water and life on Mars, and yet they found absolutely nothing, that it's totally dead. And again, that doesn't support their Big Bang dust cloud theory.
Yeah, the Big Bang Theory has certainly given scientists difficulty in trying to find proof of it. Now, what are some things about other planets that are different from what astronomers expected to find?
Well, again, with we have Titan and Ceres, a couple of the moons in the solar system, and they have found on them these same ice volcanoes, ice geysers, and they've also been seen on Enceladus and Triton. All this means that these moons must have a hot core to be able to drive a system that creates volcanoes. Io itself has, I think it has 7 active volcanoes, and it is, again, not following the predictions that they originally made using the Big Bang nebular dust cloud theory.
Has there been anything interesting discovered about Venus that was unexpected?
Yeah, Venus was another one. It's what I call kind of the stair-step theory. When they started observing Venus, they said, well, it's almost Earth-like, same size, must have about the same gravity and things like that. And so they were predicting in the 60s that this is where we'll find life outside of Earth, because one of their goals is to show that the evolutionary theory of life coming from dead things can happen again on other planets and other satellites. Venus was considered to be the one that we'll find life on there. Then we go to Venus. First of all, they predicted we're going to find life there because it's so much like the Earth. And of course, they didn't. The Russians sent a probe there that landed and found it had a surface temperature of 800 degrees Fahrenheit. And in about an hour, the machine, everything melted on it. And so it's totally impossible to inhabit. Then they started looking at Mars and finally got the probes there and found out no life there. And then they were still hoping for life on Pluto or something out there. And of course, they didn't find it there. Now they're looking at I believe now they've found supposedly 1,000 exoplanets, planets outside of the Earth solar system. They're still trying to find life on these, but the light spectrum that comes back from them indicates there might be water, but water doesn't mean there's going to be life. You have to have 20 amino acids to make life, and the chances of them bumping together in primordial seas and becoming a human, when we run the figures on it, is about 1 chance in 24 trillion opportunities. So the chance that life can just bump together, or these amino acids can bump together and form life, is mathematically impossible.
So the nebular Big Bang dust theory says that planets spun off from the sun. If we apply the law of angular momentum, which states that the planets rotate the same direction of the sun, they rotate at the same or less speed of the sun, and finally be on the same level as the sun equator, and apply that to the evolutionary model, what does it say about the formulation of the solar system?
Yeah, that's the problem, is when you apply the laws of physics, Newton's 3 laws of motion, law of gravity, and then the laws of angular momentum, which is basically Newton's 3 laws of motion, but applied to things that, go in a circle or go, off of a straight line. And that's, in fact, he invented calculus because he was trying to describe mathematically the orbits of comets, which is a long oval in their curve. And so straight line, three laws of motion do not apply to that. You have to use angular laws of motion. So he wrote calculus, invented calculus in order to solve this problem. One man said to me, math is the language of science. If you can't prove it mathematically or have a mathematical equation for your theory, then you're not talking about science. You're just talking about stories. And that's the case with evolutionism. It has lots of stories, but when you run the math, such as this case, the laws of angular momentum, then it fails. For example, the law says that anything that's spun off of the sun out of this dust cloud would have to spin the same direction as the sun. And we have Pluto, Uranus, and Venus that spin backwards compared to the sun. And so that breaks the law there. Secondly, they should spin at the same or less speed. And the sun, I believe, I didn't write it down, but it takes about 10 or 20 Earth days to rotate around its axis, whereas the Earth only takes 24 hours. So the Earth is actually spinning faster than the object that was supposed to have spun out of, which breaks the law of speed, or the second law of angular momentum. The third law, the same level. Pluto, of course, is about 17 million miles above the level of all the other planets. And so that breaks the law there. Secondly, Pluto rotates backwards to the sun, and its moon orbits at a right angle to Pluto. Therefore, the moon all the moons couldn't have spun out of the dust cloud that Pluto came out of. Then Uranus actually spins on its side with its axes pointed back towards the sun. If you righted it up, it spins backwards also. And then Venus, although it spins backwards to the sun, it also spins too slow. At its present rate of decay, it means that Venus would have to be 20 to 30 billion years old, and that's older than the universe. And in science, in the papers and things, when I was trying to study about the moons, especially, they'll say these moons are anomalies or anomalous. You have to translate that word anomalous to be they don't fit the Big Bang dust cloud theory. And so whenever you see the word anomalous, your ears should perk up and say, hey, that's probably something that doesn't fit the evolutionary model.
So as they've discovered that the planets and the moons don't quite conform to these laws, have they made addendums to them or made other changes to their evolutionary model?
The problem with the evolutionary theory is that it's a sacred cow. You never change the theory. You readjust the data or massage the data, I call it. After the Jupiter probe came back, I got, first-hand report from a science magazine. But over the years, they begin to come back and say, well, we've readjusted here, and it really does fit evolution. And I'm assuming that will happen with Pluto also. It doesn't fit the evolutionary model, but they'll massage it, they'll adjust it, and they'll say, well, now we've studied it more, and it really does kind of fit in. And they, of course, they won't tell you the anomalies that I have found or that came out in the first information. So they don't change the original theory, they just readjust the facts and data. That's what it seems like to me. When they use radiometric datings to date the rocks that they brought back from the moon, they brought over 800 pounds of rocks back over several Apollo trips. The dates range anywhere from 500,000 years old to 20 billion years old. And at the present time, they put the universe at 20 billion years old. And so you've got the moon being older than the universe. Well, I have a book that shows the dates that they got for the moon rocks. And they picked out the dates because they got different dates for all the rocks. They took out the dates that came to about 4.3 or 4.5 billion years, which that goes along with their theory. So even if data is opposite to what the theory says, if they can find, a few dates that fit their understanding, then that's the ones they'll put in. They don't tell you about the dates that were wrong.
It's often remarked that religious people manipulate facts to fit their theories, and that scientists typically create theories based on fact. And when it comes to the Big Bang and the evolutionary model, it seems that scientists do a lot of fact manipulation themselves to fit the theory. What do you think?
It tends to be that they will take the data that supports it and ignore the data that doesn't. And again, I found either in the very first reports that come back on these planets and probes, or in the case of the moon, man wrote a book on it from a creationist standpoint, looking at all the data that he could find, and gave some incredibly good conclusions on that. When I started teaching astronomy, and I've been teaching now almost 30 years of science, I was excited to get into astronomy. I thought, well, here we'll get into really good, solid science, not this, biological evolutionary stuff. And the problem is, in astronomy, they still apply it, but in many cases, you can't prove or falsify what they predict about a star forming or the dust clouds forming into stars. It'll take 5 to 7 million years before we know that actually is happening with some of these dust clouds. So we can't even be around to test their theory that way.
So how does this affect your opinion of the age of the solar system?
I think that it really hurts the model of the Big Bang dust cloud theory, because a lot of the data points to a young solar system. They couldn't have spun out of a dust cloud and be there in their present position. The sun, moon, stars, the moons and planets and things couldn't have spun out of this dust cloud and be in their present position, because it goes against Newton's 3 laws of motion as well as the angular laws. And so I believe that once God put them there in that position, now they follow Newton's 3 laws, the law of gravity and law of angular momentum. So the data points to a young solar system. The data, for me, points to an intelligent design, putting the planets and moons in their present position so that they stay there and don't fall apart and destroy the whole solar system.
Well, Russ, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for being on our podcast. Do you have any materials or upcoming dates or books that you would like to promote?
Well, I've got the book called Design versus Chaos, which is a new model of the atom called the spinning ring model of the atom. And it eliminates a lot of the problems that we find in the present standard view of the atom. Bohr and Einstein put together the first model with a proton in the center orbited by an electron. They had 6 assumptions that they used to create that model. In science, we sometimes have to use an assumption in our theory. Assumption is something we don't know, but we're going to assume that it's true. But when they made the model, they had 6 assumptions. 3 of them they knew were wrong already. One assumption is that the electron could orbit the proton without crashing and burning in a few seconds. Eventually, they had to postulate the weak and strong force kept things in its place in that. This new model of the atom uses spinning rings of energy, electrons and protons made out of spinning rings of energy, and they're held together by electrical and magnetic forces. Coulomb's law and Ampere's law, 2 electrical laws, are used to help explain the atom. Every part of it can be explained completely, and it eliminates the need for the weak and strong force totally. And so that book is available. A friend of mine is putting it on Amazon.com this fall, and that'll be available. And it's going to revolutionize science if the scientists will pick it up and run with it. The last chapter in my book touches on their theory, and now they've proven it mathematically that the gravity is an electromagnetic force, and that's what holds the moon around the Earth as well as the planets around the sun. And so this is a breakthrough. Once you can define gravity, and they've defined it mathematically using calculus, covers about 3 pages. I don't reproduce it in my book, but it's available at their website called Common Sense Science. And I've written my book in 6th grade language. I use it in the homeschool and that and teach it here. And I've actually tutored some physics students who are going on to college using that book. So that's available, or will be available this fall. I think that's one of the most important books I've written, and most important discovery that these men have made that will revolutionize science. And if we can define gravity, then we can possibly reverse it and have hover cars like we had in Star Wars.
Thank you so much, Russ, for joining us on today's episode of the Twin Cities Creation Science Association's podcast. My name is Brian Stillman Powers. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.